I don't know about you, but some of the most anxiety-provoking situations that I have ever found myself in have had to do with trying to make my way through unfamiliar territory. Some of the worst are when you have no map, and all you have to go by is the hope that you will see the right street signs before you've flown right on by them. I have to confess, though, that even worse for me have been those couple of occasions when I've had a map, but a map that simply didn't match the landscape around me, leaving me able sometimes to see where I wanted to go, but really having no idea how to get from here to there. And if you haven't heard it before, ask Cynthia sometime about our navigating our way out of the Calgary airport by using the North Star. Finding your way in unfamiliar territory can be challenging. That's why it's always best to have someone to follow. And what John has been showing us through the signs that he keeps telling us about in his gospel is that Jesus is clearly the one to show us the way through the unfamiliar territory we find ourselves in. He is the one that you want to have on your guest list when the wine runs out at the wedding of life. He is the one you want to turn to when desperation leaves you no choice but to act in faith. And here in John chapter 5, Jesus continues to lead the way. He leads the way to Jerusalem. John tells us that he had gone up for one of the annual festivals. So Jesus isn't alone. He's part of a vast crowd of people who streamed into Jerusalem at least 3 times a year. And you can assume that the ultimate destination of this trip was the temple. But just like everyone else in that vast multitude, his first stop was one of the pools. Now, if you were on vacation and had to walk from place to place, when you got to your hotel, you might think that the first place that you would want to head was the pool as well. But that's not what this pool was for. This pool lay just outside the temple, near perhaps where the sheep were brought in for sacrifice. And though it was both vast and deep, the purpose of this pool was not for diving or floating around on your air mattress, but for cleansing, ritual cleansing, so that you were ready to enter into the temple, to enter into the presence of God. And maybe that's why this pool also had some almost permanent residences. The most common name for the pool was Bethzatha, meaning the house of the flowing. But one of the variations of that name, as you can see on the screen, was Bethesda, meaning house of mercy. And that's what these semi-permanent residents were seeking. Mercy. Mercy from the pilgrims who flocked through the place, but also mercy in the form of a miracle. You see, this pool had a reputation that if you could get into the water at just the right time, you just might be healed. And so this pool had become more than just a place of cleansing for pilgrims. It had become a place of desperation, a place for last-ditch efforts and final hopes. Beneath its porticos lay the blind, the lame, the paralyzed, It was far more than just a spot on the pilgrim's itinerary, therefore. It was a hospital in need of a doctor. It was a clinic in need of a cure. And it's to that place that Jesus goes. And significantly, he doesn't just go and get out as quickly as he can. He doesn't walk straight to the water's edge, wading through the misery, pretending he doesn't see it, as so many others might have done. And that in itself may be one of the most important points this passage has to make. And it might be one of the most profound lessons it has to teach, that Jesus goes not to the places that are popular, but to the places where people are in need. He goes to the broken people, the hurting people, the desperate people, the forgotten people. And there's a lesson there for us. Later in John's Gospel, Jesus will make the wonderful promise that he is returning to the Father in order to prepare a place for us so that one day we might be where he is as well. And that hope of being with Jesus is one that gets us through some of the toughest times that life holds. But there's also a sense in which those of us whose hope is to one day be where Jesus is in heaven ought right now to be where Jesus would be if he were still here bodily on earth. If someone were to read through the Gospels and take note of the places that Jesus tended to go and the people he tended to seek out and the situations in which he tended to offer help, I don't think they'd be wrong to think that if they wanted to find some modern day followers of Jesus, they ought to be able to look in the same places and seek out the same people and watch for the same situations. The question for you and us to consider, therefore, is would they find us there? I know that some of you could answer that question, yes, absolutely. You are there. You're there in the hospitals. You are there in the nursing homes. You're there with food for St. David's or supplies for Evangel Hall. But this is something that all of us need to be keeping in mind constantly. As a follower of Jesus, am I in the places where Jesus would go? Now, when Jesus reached the pool, he took notice of one particular man. John doesn't tell us how or why this man came to his attention or what made him stand out in all that crowd. But again, John offers us some incredible insight into the heart of Christ, about who he is, about what he's capable of doing. And John does this by using two rather inconspicuous little words. Two words that nevertheless are potentially the most powerful words in this passage. Jesus sees the man, and Jesus knows him. Jesus sees. When he arrives at the pool, what he sees is not a crowd of people, but people in a crowd. He sees them as individuals, as people with unique names and faces and stories and needs. People never became statistics for Jesus. They aren't the poor or the sick or the unemployed or the grieving. They are Darlene and Mary and Paul and Jim. Jesus sees. And Jesus knows. He not only knows the names and faces, he knows the stories and the needs behind them. Beneath that carpenter's exterior is the mind that has watched your whole life story being written. He shares with the Father the insight that can penetrate any heart. Back in chapter 2, John told us that Jesus knew what was in everyone, and that continues to be the case here. He knows how long this man has been disabled. He understands what's brought him to the pool. He realizes why he's still there. In fact, he could probably tell him to the minute how long he has been waiting for this moment. And he can do the same with us. There have been times when each of us has given into the despair of thinking that no one notices, no one understands, no one cares. When the last dollar has been spent, or the last medication tried, when the papers have finally been filed, or the funeral has ended and the last friend has said goodbye, in any of those situations, any of us might be tempted to think that there isn't anybody who understands what we're going through. But in this passage, John makes sure that we understand that there is at least one person who does. Jesus sees. Jesus knows. Jesus cares. And so Jesus asks, do you want to be made well? Now, some might suggest that's a pretty silly question. After all, isn't that precisely why this man is there? Isn't it because he's sick? Isn't it because he wants a cure? And because of that, it's certainly understandable that the man takes Jesus' question the way he does, as one that seems to lay blame. Jesus simply asks, do you want to be made well? But what the man hears is, don't you want to be made well? Don't you want to get out of here? Why are you still here? So unexpected is Jesus' actual question that the man thinks he's being asked for an explanation rather than a simple yes. I can't say for sure why Jesus asks his question. There are times when he healed when nothing of the sort was required. But there are also times when Jesus did ask people to put into words what they wanted him to do for them. And if I had to guess, I'd suggest that the reason he does this is that there are times when people are more interested in having him treat their symptoms than their illness. There are times when we want relief from our distress, but not its cause. We ask for restored relationships, but we do so in the hope that it's the other person who will have to change. We ask for relief from our financial woes, but we don't want to alter our spending habits. Or even harder, learn God's lesson of contentment. And so my guess would be that Jesus wants to know if this man really knows what he wants. And more to the point, if he knows what he really needs. But it's a mark of Jesus' compassion that in spite of the man's answer, Jesus speaks. Stand up, take your mat and walk. And astoundingly, with Jesus, that's all it takes. That's what the creative power of God's word is able to do. In the last chapter, Jesus demonstrated his ability to heal from a distance. He simply declared that a man's son would be well, and he was. No touch was needed, no show was provided. He simply speaks, and it is done. And the same thing happens here. And the thing is that if this were a typical healing story in the Gospels, this is where the story would actually have ended. A great human need has been met by the even greater grace and power of God. And the jaw-dropping reality is that that need has been miraculously removed. But there is a but to this story. And that's that this healing not only happens during one of the festivals, it happens on the Sabbath. And the fact is that there are rules about what can be done on the Sabbath, strict rules. Originally, of course, the Sabbath was God's gift to humanity. It was a day for rest, a day for worship, a day to revel in the grace of God. But over the centuries, that gift had become wrapped in layer upon layer of human regulations. Legal minds had carefully calculated how much work was too much work. What kind of walk was too long a walk? How big a load was too heavy a load? And according to those regulations, both carrying a mat and healing the sick were actions that tipped the balance. And for this reason, John says, they started persecuting Jesus. For this reason, the rabbi became a rebel. But even that is not the end of the story. Because this rabbi is more than just a rabbi. And he's about to make that clear. He's about to take things not just up a notch, but to a whole different level. If healing someone on the Sabbath was able to generate some heat, what Jesus is about to say is tantamount to pouring some jet fuel on the fire. My Father is still working, and I also am working. To us, there's nothing shocking about those words. In fact, we're used to hearing Jesus talk in that kind of way. But as John makes clear, that wasn't the case back then. For this reason, he says, they were seeking all the more to kill him. Because he was also calling God his own Father, thereby making himself equal to God. And what makes John's statement especially interesting, and especially important for modern readers to pay attention to, is that neither John nor Jesus himself makes any attempt to correct their interpretation. There is no denial. There is no one who says that Jesus has been misunderstood, no one who claims he's been misquoted. In modern terms, there is no claim that this is fake news. Instead, Jesus leaves the statement and their interpretation of it as a statement of fact. By his very silence, he's saying that they got it right. They've heard what he is saying. He is making himself equal to God. And by doing that, he is unmistakably placing his foot on the road that will ultimately take him to the cross. Of course, this isn't the only time in the Gospels he will make that claim. You simply can't read the Gospels and miss it, nor can you read the Gospels and discount it. Jesus made the claim. And it's the truth of that claim that gave him the right to heal on the Sabbath. And it's the truth of that claim that gave him the power to heal in the first place. But each time he makes that claim, and each time he does anything that supports it, the cross itself looms larger and becomes increasingly unavoidable. And it's that claim, which may be the most important sign we've come to so far. The claim of one who goes to places where misery abounds. The claim of one who, no matter how large the crowd, even when it grows to 7 billion, still sees individuals. But it's also a claim that doesn't leave a middle way. It's a sign that marks a definite fork in the road. We can hear that claim and, rejecting it, turn away and allow Jesus to take his road while we take our own. Or we can embrace that claim, even if we don't completely understand it, and to continue to follow the path that Jesus follows. And follow the signs to the place they ultimately lead, to the foot of his wondrous cross. Amen.